Hey everyone, Cool Kid here, and welcome back to the Astronomy of Warframe, the series where we explore how Warframe has approached and altered real-life solar system objects to fit its own unique interpretation of space. For our second episode, we'll be taking a look at probably the most complicated planet in this entire series, Venus, the second planet from the Sun and one of the terrestrial planets, those being the rocky innermost planets of Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. Venus is very similar in size to Earth, often being called our twin or sister planet, but as we explore this world in depth, you'll find such a comparison is only skin deep. Previous episodes of this series won't be required to understand this one, though if you have watched the Mercury episode, I will call back to it on occasion. As always, big ups to Space Engine and Universe Sandbox for being great resources. I highly recommend them both if you like this kind of stuff. Beyond that, let's answer all of your burning questions about Venus, such as, if girls go to Jupiter to get more stupider, do boys go to Venus to get more penis? The answer, by the way, is yes. Like the rest of the planets, Venus is named after a Roman god, though it is the only planet to be named after a female one. Venus in Roman mythology is the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and sexuality, and as such, I can't really show you much of her because she's almost always depicted naked. If I told you that under this veneer of beauty the planet Venus was a caustic hellscape, you'd probably think the name is a bit of a misnomer, but those of you in my audience who know mythology are probably thinking, damn, they really hit the nail on the head with that one. Venus was a very important goddess in the Roman religion, being the center of many festivals and religious ceremonies. Venus is also said to be the mother of Aeneas, a soldier who survived the Battle of Troy and went on to be an ancestor of the founders of Rome, Remus and Romulus, meaning Venus herself is an ancestor of the Roman people. Venus borrows from the myths of other cultures too, namely the Greek goddess Aphrodite and the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar, who will both be relevant here in a little bit. If you're wondering why the Romans would name Venus after such an important goddess, that's because the planet is actually the third brightest object in the night sky after the sun and the moon. It's so bright, in fact, that it's misreported as a UFO incredibly often, with even former US President Jimmy Carter seemingly misidentifying the planet as a UFO. Venus also goes through phases much like the moon does, and these phases can be observed quite clearly through a telescope, which would be great if I had a telescope. Interestingly enough, many cultures thought that the Venus they saw in the morning and the Venus they saw in the evening were two different objects, and as such, some religions had different deities assigned to the same planet at different times of day. So, when it comes to missions sent to Venus, there have been a lot. Venus is the closest planet to Earth by a considerable margin whenever it's near us, being about 40 million kilometers away at its closest. Venus also has a low delta-V requirement to reach, which makes it much easier to access as well. In simple terms, delta-V is essentially how much change in velocity a spacecraft could achieve by burning its fuel, so having lower requirements means we need less fuel, which means the rocket can be lighter, which means it'll be easier and cheaper to get off of Earth. As a quick correction to the last video, high delta-V requirements are a major reason why Mercury is so hard to reach. The sun's gravity has nothing to do with it, I just misinterpreted the sources I read. So, considering the close distance and low delta-V requirements, we've sent a ton of probes there both for research and simple flybys as they went on their way to other objects. Much of the Mariner program from NASA was to study Venus, and you might remember Messenger from the Mercury episode, which also performed flybys of Venus on its way to Mercury. With all the probes and whatnot sent to Venus, I won't go in-depth about them all and their achievements here, but I do want to give a sort of high-level overview of when they were active and what they did. The first is the Venera program from the Soviets in the mid-70s and early 80s, which were the first probes to ever land on another planet and gave us our first and only pictures of Venus's surface. Next is Magellan from NASA in the late 80s and early 90s, which mapped around 98% of Venus's surface using a technology called synthetic aperture radar. Then we have Pioneer Venus 1 from NASA in the late 70s to early 90s, which was sent to Venus to explore with UV and radar suites and discovered some notable features, like dark atmospheric streaks and the Maxwell-Montes mountain range. More recently, we have the ESA's Venus Express from 2006 to 2014, which primarily studied the planet's south pole. Lastly, we have the JAXA probe Akatsuki, or the Venus Climate Orbiter, which operated from 2015 to 2024 and gave us a lot of fantastic images of the Venusian atmosphere and various wavelengths of light. All of these missions have shed light on incredibly interesting and important properties of Venus, and while it may not be super relevant to this video's main purpose, I wanted to mention them all here as I think this history is both interesting and important. Now, while it may be easy to reach Venus, studying the planet itself is actually quite difficult for a lot of reasons, with many early probes failing their missions entirely. We're going to explore the harsh and hostile conditions that make Venus a unique challenge, but to start, let's look at the basics. Venus is the second planet from the Sun, orbiting at about 0.72 astronomical units, with 1 astronomical unit being the distance between the Earth and the Sun. This translates to about 108 million kilometers or 67.5 million miles, but those numbers are so vast that I think AU are easier to intuitively understand. Venus is also very similar in size and density to Earth, with it being about 12,104 kilometers in diameter and Earth being around 12,756 kilometers in diameter. Venus has a density of 5.24 grams per cubic centimeter, which is just shy of Earth's 5.515 grams per cubic centimeter, so the gravity of both planets is also quite similar. Earth's gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared, while Venus's gravity is 8.87 meters per second squared, which is around 90% of Earth's gravity. Venus also has no moons, though it does have a few quasi-moons, which are asteroids that kind of orbit Venus, but also orbit the Sun. It's a little complicated, so for our purposes, Venus has no moons, and that's just that. Venus is a rocky planet similar to Earth, but it's covered in a thick and heavy carbon dioxide atmosphere. We'll explore that more here in a bit, but now that we've got the basics covered, let's talk about that orbit. So, like I mentioned a moment ago, Venus orbits the Sun at a distance of 0.72 AU, making it the second closest planet to our host star. Its orbit is also the least eccentric of all the planets, orbiting in a nearly perfect circle and with a relatively even distance from the Sun throughout its year. Venus also has a very low axial tilt of only 3 degrees, so it doesn't experience seasons like Earth does. To elaborate, Earth's seasons come from its axial tilt of 23.5 degrees, which makes the northern and southern hemispheres get different amounts of direct sunlight at different points throughout the year. If you're wondering how long a Venusian year is, it takes 224.7 Earth days for Venus to complete one full orbit around the Sun. Venus orbits the Sun counterclockwise like the rest of the planets, but it has a unique property when it comes to its rotation about its own axis. Instead of rotating counterclockwise like most other planets, Venus rotates clockwise, and this rotation is incredibly slow, with Venus's sidereal day taking 243 Earth days. You heard that right, a day on Venus takes longer than a year, and this slow rotation makes the planet the most spherical of all the planets. The rotation is so slow that, at the equator, the planet is only rotating at 6.5 kilometers an hour, meaning that you could walk at a brisk pace and keep up with the movement of the Sun. Because of the planet's rotation being clockwise, or what we'd call retrograde, a Venusian solar day is much shorter, being 116.75 Earth days. You may remember this from the Mercury video, but as a quick reminder, the sidereal day is how long it takes a planet to complete one full rotation on its axis, and the solar day is measured from sunrise to sunrise. Because the planet revolves counterclockwise around the Sun, but clockwise around its own axis, the planet's orbit works to help the Sun set faster than you'd expect from the sidereal day alone. So while a full planetary rotation takes longer than a year on Venus, you'd experience about 2 solar days in one Venusian year. We don't really know why Venus rotates in retrograde like this, but scientists do have a few theories. One theory is that a massive impact in Venus's past may have slowed its rotation, while another theory posits that it might be a series of gravitational interactions between both Venus and the Sun, as well as Venus and its own atmosphere. The important thing to remember here is that Venus rotates backwards and very slowly, which will be relevant later. So with the orbit and rotation down, let's circle back to Venus's atmosphere. As you've probably noticed from the footage thus far, Venus's atmosphere is the most easily observable characteristic of the planet, and it is incredibly complicated and important. This might be a bit confusing to explain, so my plan here is to cover things broad stroke, and then we'll work our way down from the upper atmosphere to the surface. So let's talk fundamentals. Venus's atmosphere is massive, as in it's about 93 times as dense as Earth's atmosphere. Keep in mind, Venus is a tad smaller than Earth, so there's about 93 times as much gas as our atmosphere in an atmosphere that's slightly smaller. To put this into perspective, on the surface of Venus, you'd experience an atmospheric pressure of 1,350 pounds per square inch, which is equivalent to being around 900 meters or 3,000 feet underwater. This atmosphere is 96.5% carbon dioxide, with the remaining 3.5% being primarily nitrogen, as well as some other trace compounds. Those of you who are familiar with our own climate situation here on Earth might know that CO2 is a very potent greenhouse gas, meaning that it traps heat in the atmosphere. With so much CO2 trapping heat from the Sun, Venus is actually the hottest planet in the entire solar system, being even hotter than Mercury despite only receiving about 25% of the solar energy that Mercury receives. Just how hot? Well, Venus sits at an average of 453 degrees Celsius, or 847 Fahrenheit, with temperatures getting as high as 482 degrees Celsius, or 900 Fahrenheit, which is hot enough to melt lead. Not only that, but because the atmosphere is so thick and CO2 heavy, the temperature doesn't vary almost at all between the day and nighttime sides of the planet either. This photo from Messenger shows that, in visible light, the atmosphere all looks pretty homogeneous. Fortunately, images from spacecraft like the Venus Climate Orbiter that are taken in the ultraviolet spectrum make many of the more intricate features stand out. Images like this are known as false color images, and they're often used to show characteristics that aren't visible with the naked eye. In contrast, the Messenger image is true color and is what you'd actually see if you were orbiting Venus yourself. Now, we'll get into all those intricate features, but we're gonna have to do it in steps. So with the atmosphere's basics out of the way, I want to start high up and work our way down to the surface. While Venus's atmosphere extends quite far into space, it's quite clear up until about 90 kilometers above the surface. At this altitude, a thin and frigid haze whips around the planet at over 100 meters per second. These winds are so fast, in fact, that they can circumnavigate the entire planet in just 4 Earth days, which is kind of insane. Moving down below 70 kilometers, we find around 99% of the atmosphere's mass and the primary cloud deck of Venus, which is full of clouds made up of sulfur dioxide, with sulfuric acid droplets suspended within. These sulfuric acid droplets are incredibly reflective, causing the atmosphere to reflect around 90% of the light that hits it, which is part of why Venus is so bright in the night sky. Other trace elements have been found at this layer too, namely oxygen, which is a byproduct of solar wind interacting with the CO2 in the atmosphere and causing it to break up into carbon monoxide and oxygen. Wind speeds at this altitude are still incredibly high, at around 70 meters per second, and these strong winds create powerful polar vortexes that were observed by Venus Express. Something else that resides in this layer are dark streaks found by Pioneer Venus 1, the origins of which are quite the mystery. While there are several theories for their origin, the fact that they're so resilient despite the high wind speed is very peculiar. One theory for the existence of these streaks is that they may be huge colonies of airborne microbes, which may have evolved a UV-absorbent coating to protect themselves. If that sounds insane, this is coming from the NASA article about Venus. I swear I'm not making this up. Trace amounts of the gas phosphine have also potentially been found, which is produced by low-oxygen microbes here on Earth. Considering the hellish conditions on Venus, you're probably surprised to hear that there's any hope of life being found here, but around 50 kilometers up in the atmosphere, the pressure and temperature are Earth-like enough that special microbes called extremophiles may be able to survive there. MIT and Rocket Lab are currently collaborating on the first ever private venture to Venus to answer whether or not these signs are really evidence of life with the Venus Life Finder probe, which is set to launch as soon as 2026. This doesn't really have anything to do with the in-game stuff if I'm honest, I just thought it was really cool and exciting, and while the jury is still out if there really is life in those choking clouds of acid, we'll have the verdict remarkably soon. Below 50 kilometers above the surface, we enter another thin haze, much like the very upper atmosphere. The temperature also begins to rapidly climb from here on out until we reach the surface. Below around 30 kilometers above the surface, the view is surprisingly clear, and it remains that way until we touch down on the surface of the planet. Standing here on the surface, we're subject to 92 times Earth's atmospheric pressure and around 850 degrees of heat. In Fahrenheit, of course, I'm a slimy American. Because the atmosphere is so dense down here, wind speeds top out at around 5 kilometers per hour, but because said wind is so heavy, it is more than capable of moving objects and obstructions across the surface. The atmosphere is so dense down here, in fact, that it behaves as a supercritical fluid, which is a special state of matter where a fluid takes on some of the properties of both a gas and a liquid. In many ways, moving through this atmosphere would feel similar to wading through strong currents in water, if you had a way to not get flattened, that is. The sulfuric acid droplets in the cloud layer reflect so much light from the sun that only 10% of it will ever reach this part of the planet, though visibility is still surprisingly good. So now that we're on the surface, I want to show you all something really cool. You remember the Soviet Venera program I mentioned back at the start of the video? Well, various probes from that program have provided us with the only 6 real-life photos ever taken from the surface of Venus. Now, originally I was going to show all 6 images, until I found out that they're all copyrighted except for the first one from Venera 9. Not only that, but apparently the only reason that this image isn't copyrighted is because the camera on Venera 9 was automatic, so the Russian Supreme Court ruled that it doesn't have any copyright protections because nobody technically took it. I'll go ahead and link the Planetary Society page in the description if you want to see the other 5 images for yourself, but for now, let's focus on this specific one. Venera 9's original photograph wasn't taken in color, but fortunately NASA has digitally reprocessed this image to look more like future Venera photos. Venera 9 lasted only 53 minutes on the surface of Venus, and the later probes that took further photographs lasted anywhere from 20 minutes to about 2 hours due to the extreme conditions. Something I do want to point out though, is that Venera 9's photo does look kinda weird, right? Well, this photo was supposed to be a panorama, but only one of the 2 lens caps would release during the mission, so we only got one half of what was supposed to be a full 360-degree image. Funnily enough, Venera 10 went on to have the exact same malfunction, resulting in its panorama also being halved. They fared better than Venera 11 and 12 though, as they both couldn't get either of their lens caps off, which is, in some cosmic sense, a cyberbully reference. Venera 13 and 14 also sent back images, with the later Venera 15 and 16 being used for orbital radar mapping instead of landing on the surface directly. Something else that is incredibly cool is that Venera 13 and 14 also returned audio from the surface of the planet, and as far as I found, that fortunately isn't copyrighted. What you're about to hear is what it actually sounds like on the surface of Venus. Okay, so now that we're through the atmosphere, what can we say about Venus's geology? Fortunately, NASA's Magellan mission was able to map around 98% of the surface of Venus using special technology called synthetic aperture radar, so we have a surprisingly good idea of how things look down on the surface. Like the photos we saw of the atmosphere earlier, this is another example of false color being used to show us things that we couldn't see with the naked eye, this time using radar to punch through the thick cloud cover and give us a surprisingly good view of the many mountains, volcanoes, and plains of lava sprawling across the landscape. If you played Warframe before Spectres of the Rail, these images were actually the basis for what Venus looked like in-game too. Oh yeah, this is still a Warframe video by the way, just thought I'd remind you. So, alongside its similar size and density to Earth, Venus is also very similar in composition, with a rocky crust and mantle leading to an iron core. From there though, the similarities end pretty quickly, with one of the biggest and most interesting ones being the total lack of plate tectonics. Here on Earth, plate tectonics are the processes by which material from the crust, or outermost layer of the planet, is renewed and recycled. This process both forms new surface material and also lets out heat from the mantle, which is the layer below the crust. Venus doesn't have these processes, but despite this, the surface appears to be relatively young geologically speaking, with scientists estimating it to be between 300 and 600 million years old, though some parts could be as young as 150 million years old. Around 80% of the surface seems to be made up of volcanic rock as well, so if plate tectonics don't operate on Venus, then what's been renewing its surface? Well, there are a few theories, but one of the main ones posits that there may be global resurfacing events that cover much of the planet in lava. The idea is that heat from the mantle gradually builds as it has no way to escape, unlike on Earth, and eventually this heat causes the mantle to burst up through the crust and cast lava across the surface. As such, a huge amount of the surface of Venus consists of cooled lava plains. We can even observe evidence of this in the thousands upon thousands of volcanoes present on Venus, though many of them aren't exactly active. We know of 167 volcanoes on Venus that are over 100 kilometers in diameter, which is especially impressive when you consider that the only structure of comparable size on Earth is the big island of Hawaii. Many of these volcanoes are what are known as shield volcanoes, named such because they resemble a warrior's shield. They're formed by low viscosity lava flowing and building up over time, giving them the wide and gradual slopes that grant them their name. These volcanoes don't erupt violently or explosively, so that's not something to worry about, but they do have an interesting effect with the atmosphere. You see, volcanoes can produce this cool phenomenon called volcanic lightning, where particles from the volcano that enter the atmosphere build up static electricity. Pioneer Venus 1 and Venus Express both found that lightning on Venus is actually much more common than we expected it to be, and while volcanic lightning is a piece of that puzzle, the whole picture is still a bit hazy. We aren't entirely sure why lightning is so common on Venus, but what I know is that it's cool as hell. Another neat thing about Venus is that it has very few craters, though it isn't that hard to grasp why. With the atmosphere being so thick, any objects less than 50 meters in diameter fragment and disintegrate before ever reaching the surface. There are about 900 known craters on Venus, and they are all at minimum about 3 kilometers in diameter due to this effect. Erosion on Venus is very slow compared to Earth due to the slow movement of the wind at this layer of the atmosphere, so while there aren't a ton of craters, the ones that do exist are in remarkably good condition. Speaking of erosion, Magellan also found channels that suggest that liquid water may have existed on Venus in its past, which is very surprising. There are many theories for where this water went and how long it's been gone, but we do have solid evidence that at the very least it was there at some point. Alright, let's take a look at some geological features. The two most important ones to know are Venus's continents of sorts, which are raised land masses that cover large parts of the planet. The first is Aphrodite Terra, which stretches across much of the equator and is about the size of South America. The second is Ishtar Terra, which is a rocky highland near the northern pole of the planet, which is about the size of Australia. Ishtar Terra is also home to a mountain range known as the Maxwell Montes, which means that again, in a cosmic sense, this is a reference to big boobs. Aside from these landmasses and all the volcanoes, Venus is also home to some odd pancake-looking structures with flat tops and steep sides. We think these form from lava extruding out from the surface and building up on itself over time. Features called tesserae are also present, and to quote NASA, tesserae are terrain with intricate patterns of ridges and grooves that suggest the scorching temperatures make rock behave in some ways more like peanut butter beneath a thin and strong chocolate layer on Venus. I don't entirely know how to interpret that last part, honestly. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, the last thing I want to look at is Venus's magnetosphere, as it's very strange. So, on Earth, the magnetic field that protects us from solar wind is formed by something called a dynamo effect, where electrically conductive fluid in the Earth's core circulates and generates electrical currents, which produces the field. This is a pretty massive oversimplification, but it's how the process works both here at home and on several other planets. With how similar Venus is to Earth, you'd expect the same process to produce its magnetosphere, but that's surprisingly not the case at all. Venus actually has no self-produced magnetosphere, which was very surprising to scientists. One theory for this disparity between Earth and Venus is that Earth's dynamo may have been jump-started by the massive impact that formed the moon, while Venus never had such an impact and thus its dynamo never started rolling. This kinda messes with the theory that a massive impact slowed Venus's rotation, but that's besides the point. While Venus may not produce its own magnetosphere, it does have what's called an induced magnetosphere. High up in the Venusian atmosphere, UV radiation from the sun excites electrically charged particles, or ions, forming a layer that's called an ionosphere. Earth has one of these as well, so it's nothing unique to Venus, but it does hold the key to an important interaction. You see, the sun's solar wind also partially carries the sun's own magnetic field, and when this solar wind interacts with the ionosphere, a faint induced magnetic field is formed. Because it's formed by the solar wind blasting the planet, a sort of teardrop shape is formed around Venus, with its tail facing away from the sun. This induced magnetic field doesn't really do all that much for Venus when it comes to protecting it from solar wind, but I do think its existence is super cool, so I'm subjecting you to my shitty explanation of how it works. Alright, that's all I wanted to cover for Venus's real-life attributes. Like last time, note that this is not at all comprehensive, and there's loads more stuff I could talk about, but this is all that I think is relevant for this video's main purpose. To serve as the bridge between fact and fiction, I want to go over each of the mission nodes present on Venus and explain the origins of their names. First up is E-Gate, which should be pretty obvious. It's the node that directly connects us to the Venus junction on Earth, so it likely stands for Earth Gate. Next up is Kilokin, which is actually super interesting. The node is named after a boy in a myth from the Maasai people of southern and central Kenya and northern Tanzania. In the myth, the boy Kilekin, whose name is spelled slightly differently than the node, is an embodiment of the planet Venus and helps a farmer with his cattle in exchange for not being pressed about his origin. When the farmer breaks this trust and tries to spy on Kilekin, he returns to the sky as Venus. I mentioned this earlier, but many ancient cultures believed Venus in the day and Venus at night were two different bodies in the sky. For the Maasai, the morning Venus was Kilekin and the evening Venus was another deity named Lekin. Next we have Aphrodite, which is named after the Greek goddess of love and beauty and also the real-life geological feature Aphrodite Terra. Next is Cytherean, which is a little different. This node's name is in reference to the Greek island of Cythera, which was the birthplace of the goddess Aphrodite. The word originally referred to things from Cythera, but in a more modern context, it refers to things that are related to Venus. Next up is V Prime, which kind of like M Prime is a bit of a mystery to me. I saw several comments on the previous video mentioning that it was originally part of the path from Mercury through to Earth, and that each of the prime nodes helped to show the correct path to players. But in a modern context, it just kind of sits off to the side, forgotten and alone. In lore, I imagine it's just an important region in orbit around Venus, but I don't really know for sure. Moving on, we have Romula, which is a feminine name that comes from Romulus, the founder of Rome and mythological descendant of the goddess Venus. Using the feminine version of the name Romulus ties into a recurring theme with these node names. Many of them are feminine in some way, be it through their mythological association or otherwise. I just thought that was interesting to point out. Next is fossa, which is a Latin term meaning ditch or trench, often used to describe long troughs on planets like we saw with Pantheon fossae in the Mercury episode. There are several fossae on Venus, so this makes sense. Unda is a Latin word meaning things like wave, surge, and billow. In the context of astronomy though, undae are fields of sediment dunes. Only Mars and Venus are known to have undae, and considering that Mars is the sand planet, it's kinda weird that Venus got this node name. Our next node, Venera, is fortunately an easy one. It's the Russian word for Venus, and is also the name of their Breakthrough Venus exploration program. I brought up Venera not too long ago, but I do want to say that it was a momentous achievement, and the story of the program is really interesting if you want to look into it. The node Tessera is named after regions of highly deformed crust found on Venus, which seem to be the oldest known parts of the surface. We think they may be formed from intense interactions between the crust and mantle, but many theories exist as to their origins. I kinda forgot to mention this node in my original script read, but linea is a Latin word meaning line or stripe. In the context of astronomy, lineae are long markings across the surface of an object, and they can be either light or dark in color. Venus is far from the only object in the solar system to have lineae present, but it does have a lot of them, so this node's name also makes sense. Next up is Ishtar, which is named after the Mesopotamian goddess of love and beauty, and also the real-life geological feature Ishtar Terra. The node Montes is a Latin word meaning mountain, but what it's likely referring to in specific is the Maxwell Montes mountain range discovered by Pioneer Venus 1. These mountains are 11 kilometers tall, and the range extends from 853 kilometers lengthwise and 700 kilometers in width. Because the peaks are so high up, the top of these mountains are the coolest and least pressurized places on Venus' surface. Malva is another node based on a name, this time being a Greek name that means soft or soothing. Malva is also a genus of flower, and both the flowers and name have strong connections to imagery associated with the Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite. Our next node is one of the most important on Venus, Fortuna, which is named after a real-life feature called Fortuna Tessera that resides on the eastern Ishtar Terra. This has a double meaning though, as Fortuna is also the Roman goddess of luck and fortune, tying thematically into the Corpus's efforts to gain value from the surrounding region. If you remember Boethius from the last episode, his writings are a large part of why Fortuna remained relevant as a goddess even through the Middle Ages, which I thought was really interesting. Now on to the most important node on Venus, the Orb Vallis. The Vallis part is easy, that's just the Latin word for valley, but I don't really know about the orb part. Considering that the giant spider robots are called orb mothers, I wonder if the region gets its name from orb weaver spiders, which I will not be showing a picture of because my boyfriend is arachnophobic. I mean, personally I don't see the problem with letting spiders get married, but whatever. It could also mean that the valley is, I don't know, full of orbs, but that seems kinda silly. Or does it? I'm serious though, I actually do have some evidence. Our final node is Vesper Relay, which was tragically blown to pieces back during Operation Eyes of Blight. You remember how I said that many cultures believed the morning and evening Venus to be different objects? Well, Vesper was the Roman name for specifically the evening Venus, being associated with the Greek deity Hesperus. These guys are ultimately fairly minor deities, but I still think it's cool to note how often the morning and evening Venus misconception occurs throughout history. Okay, so after all the real-life information I've given you, I don't doubt some of you have probably been thinking, what the fuck? What do you mean Venus is a choking, roasted hellscape? Warframe taught me that Venus is completely frozen over. Well, there actually is an in-game explanation for this that I think is really cool. First though, I want to quickly read the Codex fragment for Venus. Hidden and entrenched in the mountainous peaks of Venus, the Corpus practice their industrious craft. The superstructures built here are testaments to the inventive Corpus engineers that have settled in regions where lingering Orokin technology still moderates surface temperatures. If that's not enough for you, then I have something even better. The developers explaining their original vision, which I think is great insight. The following clip is from Devstream 107 showing concepts for the Orb Vallis, and it's both a fascinating glimpse into what we could have gotten, and great elaboration on what we did end up getting. This clip is a little long, but I'll give a recap once it's over.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll come back to this. What's the next one?
Okay. Sorry, Dean.
No, this is wrong too.
No.
Yeah, keep going. I'll tell you when to stop. Keep going. Keep going.
Back and watch the order.
Keep going.
Did you get it completely backwards?
All right.
Okay.
So this is probably the good place to start.
All right.
How do you start with this? All right, I'm ready. How do you start?
This is
going to show us.
Oh man, this is to explain the wacky science of this too. But so Venus is an oven. It's very hot,
Diagram.
Yeah. Okay, Venus is an oven.
and we kind of talked about how we kind of talked about a few like ways to kind of create a terraforming process for Venus, because the Corpus are the faction on this. But the idea was that the Orokin had tried to terraform Venus, or had started to, but never really got to finish it before they fell. And the Corpus kind of discover the ancient Orokin tech, kind of jerry-rig it to get it working again. The idea was that these giant golden orbs, the Orokin would shoot into orbit. They would freeze and build glaciers on top, and the weight of those glaciers would come crashing back down into the surface, explode, and the water you're seeing there isn't actually water, it's a coolant that gets pulled in by those towers. They're called weeping posts, and they're the refrigeration process. So
For the oven.
they're kind of the temperature control. So the coolant kind of keeps the temperature control of the storms. And the reason why I'm explaining that is the kind of the systems that we put in Eidolon for the day and night cycle for like kind of level gating players. We're not going to have day and night on Venus, but the winter storms are going to be the level gating, the cycle. So there's going to be pockets of storms on the surface of the planet. So you actually will see glaciers crashing into the surface.
That's fantastic. That
yeah,
sounds super big.
yeah.
But they're like mega glaciers.
No, we have to keep going
Yeah,
forward,
they're
Dean,
like-
actually.
Yeah, but he's right. So he goes back and then
smart.
go back again. So this is kind of an idea of what the terraforming process brings out on Venus as far as the vegetation and such.
And I think what was important to us, and I think what Keith did really well in the initial ideas was we didn't want to recreate the photography of Venus
Absolutely,
as we know
yeah.
it now,
Yeah.
which is not really as interesting as we
No.
really want to kind of push it more and have a much more fantastical
Yeah.
prog rock cover.
The prog rock was
prog
like
rock
the
cover.
70s,
This is
yeah.
heavy metal.
70s
Yeah.
album cover.
If you look at some Yes album covers.
And
Yeah.
of course, then it's also we're also fraught with all kind of weird choices we made very early on in the game, where the Venus levels were snowy, and we had always thought that was because of the idea. If you wanted to terraform Venus, you have to cool it down.
Yeah.
And if you left the fridge on because the Orokin, left, then it would continue and kind of get colder and colder. So that kind of continues and plays on that side.
Yeah.
And the technology you saw on those previous two are the the coolant towers, the weeping towers.
Right.
Yeah,
So.
yep.
And then we're here, this is a formed glacier. If you go to the next picture, it's sort of just another take on that.
Yeah, just a further rendering of it with
Yeah.
a kind of a bit of some exploration on the landscape as well.
And then the next one, I believe, is a GIF.
Oh yeah, this is kind of just showing the kind of the formation of the glaciers as they go, which is up in the air of like how much of this we'll see in game, but we wanted to kind of explore this, that hopefully we can kind of show it forming. But the idea is to give players the sun is going to kind of move around the horizon, so we have like an interesting light source, but this to create some language where the players kind of know.
Yeah,
kind of-
telegraphing all bits at full ice capacity.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah.
So these happen in cycles.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's so cool. Oh my God.
It's sort of like the cooling is like malfunctioning, and then it crashes back down, and tries again.
Yep.
And the Corpus are there trying to fix it, but it's not working yet.
Right.
And that creates the rhythms.
All right.
So, to recap, Venus was terraformed by the Orokin using meteors that would grow and gather ice up in space before crashing down to the surface. This coolant they collected would then be sucked up and distributed by the Weeping Towers, which worked to cool the planet. After the fall of the Empire, though, the terraforming process never stopped, freezing over what was supposed to be a fairly temperate operation. This doesn't answer all of the questions about Venus's terraforming, though, namely what the Orokin did to the atmosphere, as it really should be turning us into a pancake. Thursby also says this line in Vox Solaris.
You ever been out on the Vallis, boss? She's a miracle, she is. A blizzard in a firestorm. All thanks to the magic of rebooted Orokin tech. And the blood and the sweat of so many thousands of Solaris.
This implies that the rest of Venus is still really hot, which honestly might make this operation even more impressive. It also implies that the actual terraformed area is much larger than just the Vallis, but still not quite on the scale of the entire planet. We can actually get a glimpse at the Orokin-era Vallis through the Vistograph image, The Vallis Breathes, which seems to have taken inspiration from the original Venera images. So, now that we've got the broad stroke stuff out of the way, let's talk about skyboxes. The first one I want to talk about is the Orbiter Skybox, as it has some very noteworthy stuff. First off, the atmosphere is much more detailed than it is in real life, in visible light at least. I find that to be perfectly fine though, as the cue ball that it is in reality isn't exactly that visually appealing. If you look closely, you can also see what seems to be the firestorms that Thursby mentioned. If you look at the planet in the Railjack skybox, you can also see these taking place, and they could be signs of volcanic activity or some other wacky shit going on. With the cold region surrounding the Vallis, it's possible the wild temperature variation could be driving even more extreme weather, but I'm not a meteorologist. Or an astronomer, actually. I'm not qualified to make this video at all. There's also this sort of anomalous cloud of stellar gas, and this kind of thing is going to be a recurring oddity throughout this series. It's very pretty, absolutely, but I do want to point out that it's not true to life. Okay, now let's talk about the proverbial elephant in the skybox. What is this thing? We have the sun here, but then the sun's sun is just over here, even though I said that Venus has no natural satellites. So what is this? Well, as far as I can tell, this is a giant Corpus reflector that's being used to keep the Vallis and its surrounding region in a permanent state of daytime. Why do I think this? Well, if you look up on the Vallis, you can see it, and there's a point of interest called reflector control that makes direct reference to it. I'm guessing the Corpus are using the reflector for more work efficiency, as constant daylight all across the region is probably easier and cheaper than messing around with nighttime gear on every single one of the thousands of Solaris and crewmen present in the area. Speaking of those crewmen, let's talk about the planet's dominant tile set, the Corpus Ice Planet. The Corpus ship tile set is also present here, but I'm going to talk about that more in a future episode. I have a confession to make though. I don't really know what goes on here. Throughout the tile set you can find lots of stuff that looks fairly important and productive. Locker rooms, cargo containers of resources, all that kind of thing. There are also loads of cargo ships and landing pads around, and even this giant osprey, alongside the trademark snow and coolant rivers that we've come to know. Thing is, I don't really know what any of this material is actually used for, or where it even comes from. We have all these locker rooms and storage containers and whatnot, but we don't see anything being unloaded, mined, or manufactured, so I really don't know what the point of all this is. Maybe these bases are some kind of hub for transporting resources? Maybe the mining or manufacturing is all being done below ground and out of sight? I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. This feels like a Potemkin village of sorts, where everything is set up so that it all looks like it means something, but once you focus your attention, none of it really does anything. I think you can definitely draw some conclusions about what goes on here. They're definitely transporting a lot of resources at the very least, but I can't definitively say much more beyond that. There's also this one mobile defense tile that looks like a data center, so we have that, but the purpose of most of these rooms isn't entirely clear. We also have this huge, imposing dam in one of the defense/interception tiles, which is both awesome and marks another tile with a clear purpose. My personal theory is that they're either mining in a nearby area or doing manufacturing underground like they do with the Raptor, but I don't really know for sure. Something that I think is very interesting about this tileset as a whole is the amount of unique plant life it has. Grasses, flowers, even trees, all things you won't see much of out on the Vallis, which we'll get to in a bit. There are also occasional Orokin artifacts like at the bottom of this pit, which I also think is really interesting. This tileset also has a unique mechanic in the Condor dropship, which will periodically bring in squads of Corpus troops. At higher levels it can even deliver Ambulus proxies, but that's more of a Pluto thing. I'm just gonna be honest, I got a ton of footage of this tileset while working on this video, and I kind of just want to yap so I can keep showing it. Not just because I spent like an hour getting it, but because this tileset is still incredibly good looking even after all these years. One last thing I wanted to note about this tileset is the presence of the frost leaf, which has the following description. This plant provides a natural food source in frigid areas of the origin system. Huh, Venusian space spinach, that's neat. Beyond the tiles themselves, the skybox for this tileset was also changed somewhat recently, and there's a lot of interesting stuff to find in it. At a glance, you can quickly tell that the Corpus ice spaces are in a valley surrounded by mountains, which lines up with the codex description. For more specific features, let's start with the Weeping Tower with a large Corpus structure connected to it. Unlike other towers that we'll see on the Vallis, this one doesn't seem to be flowing any coolant, so it's possible the large Corpus structure siphoned it up. Near this tower is a coolant river flowing into some type of reservoir, so it's also possible that maybe the tower just failed and the Corpus are trying to reactivate it. The Vox Solaris quest and some signs on the Orb Vallis show that Corpus structures are used to regulate and reactivate these towers, so I think that's the most likely explanation. Looking around more, we can find this large crashed Orokin structure. We'll see this on the Vallis too, so we'll talk about it later when we can get a better look at it. We also have this ominous glowing red light, which I have no idea what it's here for, honestly. The last major thing is a large structure with loads of vehicles nearby. This could be some kind of transport hub or vehicle depot, or maybe even some kind of warehouse. Honestly, with a parking lot this sparse, it could also be an AMC. There's another neighboring structure nearby, but the details are tough to make out, so I don't really know for sure what it is. Sometimes these structures can have blue lights emitting from them, which I do have a theory for, but we'll talk about that later too. Alright, moving on from the regular tile set, it's time to talk about the most important location on the entire Venus map, the Orb Vallis. This area gives us a ton of important insight into the lore of Venus, both from an astronomy standpoint and a sociological standpoint. I do want to say up front though, I'm not going to be focusing too much on the sociological stuff, as in-depth discussion of the Solaris and Corpus at large aren't really within the scope of this video. I will still give a sort of high-level overview of them, but we aren't going to be diving too deep into subjects that aren't directly related to Venus's astronomy, geology, and meteorology. This video is going to be long as hell as is, I gotta stay focused. So let's get a quick overview of the Vallis itself. This area is dotted with several weeping towers, alongside craters from meteor impacts and several ponds of coolant, culminating in a central lake that serves as a coolant reservoir. This coolant contains special robots known as servofish, which perform various functions within the coolant and are found in different parts of it as well. Most of these are of Corpus design, but some ancient Orokin-era bots do still exist. These servofish also have adornments, which are additional attachments that seem to provide more functions to the robot. They range from basic, to adorned, to magnificent, going from least to most rare. We also have these guys, which are known as the Gorgericus fungi, alongside the mitocardial fungi at their base. We can also see these large white stalks that also seem to be part of this mycelial network. You can even find luminescent shrooms in the cave networks, which I think is neat. I think it's possible that these mushrooms could have been placed here by the Orokin to filter the atmosphere, or maybe to enrich the soil for future plants. Or they could have just shown up because they feel like it. I mean, mushrooms on Earth are older than trees. They just do that. Speaking of the mushrooms, several other forms of natural life are present. We'll go more in depth about these critters in Warframe Geographic too, but I wanted to highlight that this vibrant and complex ecosystem does exist. Plant life also exists in the form of the cave-dwelling Tepa plant, which is described as a plant that thrives in frigid environments. Loads of caves can be found across the Vallis, which primarily contain coolant flows, both liquid and frozen, strange glowing plants that remind me of aloe leaves, and the aforementioned glowing mushrooms, along with these odd floral pods that launch the player and enemies upwards when stepped on. These plants aren't exclusively cave-dwelling though, as we can occasionally find them on the surface as well. They seem to be some kind of merger of Orokin technology and the fungi that sprawls across the Vallis, which is both interesting and disconcerting. Speaking of enemies, the Corpus have a major presence in the region, with loads of outposts established along various points in their massive road network. Nefanyo, one of the major players on the Corpus Board of Directors, heads up this operation, and sees reclaiming and defrosting the Vallis as an investment that will bring him great personal wealth. We'll go over each of these outposts in depth and explore their purposes here in a little bit, but something I do want to bring up is that players can actually capture these bases. Enemies near these locations sometimes drop data masses that can be used to start a defense objective. and once that process is complete, the base can be used to start bounties. We also have the giant Corpus reflector overhead, which ties into another mechanic. The Vallis doesn't go through day and night cycles, but instead cold and warm cycles, with cold cycles lasting 20 minutes and warm cycles lasting 6 minutes and 40 seconds. My theory for how these work is that the reflector is slowly sweeping back and forth across the region, which causes these temperature shifts. When the light isn't directly over the Vallis, it's colder, but when it's more direct and focused, it's warm. I'm guessing that the Corpus may be doing this as a strategy to aid in the thawing of the region, but because it's so large, they can't do it all at once. The real reason is probably that DE needed an excuse to have a rotating cycle that was separate from Venus's incredibly long solar days, but that's no fun, is it? Interestingly enough, this wasn't always the vision for the Vallis, as that Devstream clip previously revealed. Originally, we were going to have glaciers rising up and crashing down, alongside storm pockets that would serve as higher difficulty areas. You can even shatlink an unused item in-game called the Orokin Monitor that makes direct reference to this original plan. The Vallis is also surrounded by a constant winter storm, though whether or not it's an intentional construction of the Corpus or just a gameplay mechanic is up for debate. I could see the Corpus doing it deliberately to prevent the Solaris from escaping, but I don't believe that it's ever really explained. Another minor piece of lore I wanted to bring up is that of Sigor Sava's journals, which can be found when killing ghouls during Ghoul Purge events. Hidden audio within them tells the story of specimen VK7, which is actually Venari, but more importantly for our discussion is that it reveals the existence of dormant infested in the region. Venari was first found by the Corpus because she was targeting and destroying these hives long before Corpus extermination crews arrived. So, thanks Venari? I won't go any more in-depth about the story here, but I will leave a link to the full story in the description if you want to read it. The Corpus in this region are outfitted with special cold weather equipment to help them survive the harsh environment, on top of employing more technologically advanced proxies like jackals and hyenas. These Terra Corpus likely serve directly under Neff himself, and are seriously difficult compared to their non-Terra counterparts. These guys have really high damage, knock your ass around, and electrocute you so often you'd think it's conversion therapy. Nope, still gay. The main unique enemies these guys bring to the table are the Rachnoids, which are these weird spider bots with several variants. We have the tiny helicopter mite Rachnoids, the freaky head-detonating Cytorachnoids, and the often invisible shockweb-deploying Chitorachnoids. We also have the Orb Mothers, which are giant Rachnoids that are used to protect major locations. The Prophet Taker Orb is perched atop the Enrichment Labs location, and the Exploiter Orb patrols near the Temple of Prophet, escorted by her cohort of Coolant Rachnoids. Speaking of coolant Rachnoids, let's talk about an event that sometimes appears on the Vallis: thermal fractures. I'll let Utico explain.
Quick geology lesson. Thermal fractures are what you get when you pump too much coolant into the ground too fast. Displaced thermia has to go somewhere. Now we've got thermia fractures threatening to roast Fortuna. Neff can fix this, but he won't. Instead, he's got that mucking exploiter orb harvesting the surface thermia for quick profit. Get out there, locate a fracture, and I'll help you seal it. Oh, and Sparky, you run into that exploiter orb out there, you leg it. Once she ices up, nothing can touch her.
So, when too much coolant is pumped into the ground too fast, heat from the planet itself bursts up and causes problems. The Exploiter Orb is harvesting this thermia for a profit, but killing her coolant Rachnoids drops coolant cells that we can use to seal them properly and protect Fortuna. The more cells you insert, the longer the defense is and the harder it gets, but in exchange, you make more progress towards the diluted thermia used to start the Exploiter Orb boss fight. Loading 4 coolant cells into one fracture causes a variety of modifiers to occur at random, with one of them being thermal Rachnoids, which are modified mite Rachnoids that set you on fire. The important takeaway here is that the terraforming process takes time unless you want one of those resurfacing events I mentioned earlier to occur a few 100 million years sooner than expected. Okay, one last important thing to note. Prior to the new war quest, the Vallis looks like the average Iowan winter, as the Corpus are seemingly too incompetent to get it working correctly. After the events of the new war, though, the Vallis seems to be in the process of thawing, likely because Vallis was able to enforce the original Orokin vision of Venus's terraforming. The rest of Venus's terraformed area is still totally frozen for whatever reason, but, you know, they'll get to it. This even introduces new trees, grass, and flowers to the area, on top of making the lighting look like complete shit. I know the Vallis is supposed to look like this, but I'm gonna be honest, I think this is a massive downgrade from the Winter Wonderland version. I'm going to be going back and forth between both versions of the Vallis in this video, using the Captura scene for the pre-quest variant and the regular mission node for the post-quest variant. I just wanted to establish this disparity now so it's not confusing later. Okay, with all of the boilerplate out of the way, let's talk about Fortuna itself. Quick disclaimer, this will contain spoilers for both the Vox Solaris quest and the Solaris United Syndicate. Before I go into detail about Fortuna myself, I want to once again show you all some additional insight from Devstream 107, as it helps explain a lot for me. I'm going to do my best Hasan impression, so I'll catch you all again here shortly.
All right, next up we have, as you would expect, like the
Yeah.
Plains of Eidolon has the Ostrons. Perhaps
So
Venus.
yeah, it is going to come with like another culture. I guess it is. Yeah.
But they're correct.
Yeah. So the coolant that we talked about back up on the surface, because it kind of gets old, and as it gets used, it gets really thick and goopy. So we were thinking that this society called the Solaris United.
That's right.
They are kind of a labor force for the Corpus, not a happy labor force either. Right. And they're here processing the coolant. So they kind of clean it, refine it, and kick it back up to the surface. So when you go down to the town, you'll actually walk through canals of coolant, and you'll see them kind of in skiffs, kind of offloading.
Fortuna is one of seemingly several subsurface outposts in the region that are occupied by the Solaris, which are a race of cyborgs that work in debt slavery to revive the Vallis for Neff. I know that was a lot of information to take in at once, so I'm going to do my best to break it down, starting with the structures that make up Fortuna itself. Fortuna appears to be some kind of underground operations center linking to the coolant rivers up above, with free-flowing coolant running through it. There are also loads of vents and pipes throughout the complex, which are most likely to control the gases that evaporate off of this subsurface coolant. We also have some absolutely banger bisexual lighting, as well as the 24/7 propaganda channel running at full blast. These design traits are even carried above ground, with a complex of network pipes surrounding a coolant pond that is right next to Fortuna. These above-ground pipes may be used to expel impurities, alongside the vents likely being used to get rid of the harmful vapors of the subsurface coolant. There's also this K-drive ramp that launches you, which is awesome. The Solaris are working in some fairly OSHA-violating conditions, all things considered, but they don't seem too bothered by that. You can find Solaris working hard doing stuff, I guess, as well as various locker rooms and storage areas. There also seems to be a lot more to Fortuna deeper within the ground that we are unable to access, and my guess is that it's some form of housing for the many Solaris that live here. So, let's talk about those Solaris. Let's start with a pretty critical question. What do I mean by debt slavery? Well, the augments and upgrades the Solaris employ to do their jobs cost money, which they can't really afford up front. As such, they go into debt to do the job that is supposed to get them out of debt, with this cycle being designed to trap them in that debt forever. For some insight into the nature of these debts, I want to read the descriptions of the debt bond items, which give some added context for what kinds of debts the Solaris are saddled with. Training debt bond. The taxmen call it an investment in our future, but loans to cover vocational and specialist training almost always cost more than you'll ever earn, especially with the interest. Shelter debt bond. Covers everything from hab rent to insurance, docking permits, and paying off that rail tractor, big ticket items. Medical debt bond. To get work, you need mods. Then you need more work to pay for the mods, so you get more mods. And here we are. Advances debt bond. Sometimes a rig jockey needs a helping hand, so they get an advance on the next pay. Massive interest rates almost guarantee they'll be paying that off forever. Familial debt bond. Debts unpaid by one generation are passed down to the next. Working to pay them off is seen as something to be proud of. What choice do they have? So, what happens if the Solaris fail to pay off these debts? Well, we can talk with Ticker to view the various consequences, ranging from hard labor, to limb repossession, to full-on brain shelving. This also reveals that the Solaris aren't exclusive to Fortuna or even Venus, as they can be tasked with things like orbital mining. The business, who is the conservation and fishing expert of Fortuna, has a different accent than the rest of the Solaris, which further drives this point home. Side note, making the race of debt prisoners all have an Australian accent is some masterful world building. With all of this debt and all of these augments, what kind of work do the Solaris actually perform? Well, in typical video game fashion, it's a lot of nothing, with workers just kind of acting busy. Hammering the same spot forever, bolting or welding the same spot forever, that kind of thing. I can only assume that much of what we see is the Solaris constructing Fortuna itself and maintaining its various systems, but it's a bit ambiguous. Fortunately, item descriptions from various operator armor sets grant insight into the more specific roles the Solaris take up. Let's run through those now. Haz-Tech. When coolant off-gases or a fusion gen gets cracked, it's everybody out. Everybody except the Haz-Techs. Operator armor modeled on the daredevils of Fortuna's maintenance crews. Smelter. Operator armor inspired by those Solaris who must work in searing heat. That's kind of vague, but the name Smelter kind of fills in the gaps there, I think. Outrider. Operator armor modeled on envirogear worn by the surveyors and scouts of the Orb Vallis. Protected by an all-weather cloak, they catalog the wildlife, seek out resources, and chart safe routes for patrols and miners. Vent Rat. Living in Fortuna, a lot of repairs need to happen in the vents. lightweight and practical operator armor designed for flexibility and tight squeezes. It shouldn't be surprising considering the circumstances that the Solaris have a very adversarial relationship with the Corpus, calling them the Taxmen. To fight back against the oppression they face, the Solaris have formed an underground movement called Solaris United, headed up by floor boss Utico as her alter ego, Vox. SU dispatches both their own operatives and Tenno to the Vallis for operations that fight back against the Corpus, from saving captive Solaris to obtaining high-value intel to draining the Taxmen's wallets. Thus far, we've met Utico, Biz, and Ticker, as well as the joke-cracking teenager Thursby, who becomes Legs after the end of the Vox Solaris quest. SU does have a few other notable members though, such as Smokefinger, who handles mining and geology-related tasks, Little Duck, who is an enigmatic infiltrator that's not afraid to get her hands dirty, and Rude Zood, who builds unregistered firearms with guidance from the voice in her head known as Chatter. Stay based, Zood. Aside from the adults, we can also find the Vent Kids, which are orphan children that live in the vents. There's a lot to unpack there I'm just gonna ignore. These children scrape Corpus resources to build K-Drives, which are hoverboards inspired by Marilina, the living creature that Ureli uses as her skateboard. The Vent Kids also draw graffiti around the Vallis, and are generally just kind of a nuisance to the Corpus. There are two factions of Vent Kids, the Kubradons, which are led by Boone, and the Paubers, which are led by Roki. These kids aren't super important for what we're talking about, I just wanted to bring them up to be thorough. Alright, one last thing about Fortuna. Like with the Vallis, Fortuna also changes after the events of the New War, showing the lasting impact and armor left during its occupancy. I'm gonna be honest, I think this is kinda stupid. Not only do I miss the bisexual lighting, but I don't understand why the Solaris don't just take all this stuff down. Fortuna is still functionally the same, though there is a vent from the quest that can be entered and shows a little Vent Kid hideout. I don't think it's safe for them to be this close to the coolant, to be honest. I think this place looks worse, so I've been relying on Captura footage, but again, it's important to highlight. Okay, now that we're through all of that, we can finally hop in the elevator and make our way up to the Orb Vallis. Our exploration is going to be divided up into 4 categories: points of interest, major bases, caves, and unmarked locations. I'm going to go category by category to make it easier, starting with the regular points of interest. To start, I actually want to take a look at 3 similar locations: Asta Crater, Ustara Crater, and Harindi Crater. Looking at Asta Crater, we can see a large structure of golden tendrils radiating out from a central mass, with bits of rock and ice stuck to it. The Corpus appear to be harvesting parts of this structure, but for what purpose isn't entirely clear. If you look nearby, you can also find a Weeping Tower, which has a Corpus device connected to it. The Vox Solaris quest establishes that this structure is used to control the tower using the mineral Amarast, which is kinda convenient actually. The proximity of this tower to Asta Crater also gives us a big clue as to why this crater exists. These golden tendrils, do they remind you of anything? My first thought was the GIF shown on Devstream 107 of the glacier formation process. It seems like these central orbs grow these golden tendrils, which then ice up before crashing down. The nearby Weeping Tower was likely placed here strategically to drink up the coolant deposited by the impact and distribute it across the surrounding region. Nearby, we can find the Pearl, which is a Corpus base that seems to be analyzing one of the orbs at the heart of the glacier formation structures. Are these the orbs that give the Orb Vallis its name? I'm sorry, I'll lock in. A swirling mass of coolant can be found underneath, which makes me wonder if the Corpus are analyzing this technology in an attempt to reverse engineer it. We can also find this structure that contains a vehicle partially composed of giant domestic drones, which is rad as hell. Ustara Crater is very similar to Asta, with the same golden tendrils and Weeping Tower in close proximity, so I won't go too in-depth about it. Harindi Crater is also similar to the other two, but with a major difference. Beneath the central pearl, there is a giant pit where coolant from the nearby Weeping Tower flows. I'm not sure if this is here for a specific purpose or if the meteor just so happened to land on a fissure within the crust, but I think it's a neat detail. On the topic of the Weeping Towers, let's talk about Coolant Reservoir, which is marked on the map as a small island sitting in the middle of a massive coolant lake. This coolant lake seems to connect to Fortuna directly, which might explain the river running through it. Many of the waterways running into the reservoir seem to originate from inside the planet itself, so much of the coolant that's actually present on the Vallis is likely subsurface. The island in the middle contains a Weeping Tower that seems to be a bit larger than all of the others in the region, which makes sense considering its purpose. This massive lake likely serves as an aggregation point for all of the coolant across the Vallis, giving it a central spot to be organized and processed before it's distributed elsewhere. Interestingly enough, we can also see the golden tendrils from the crater surrounding the tower. I wonder if these tendrils are used to drink up the coolant like Jeff described, or maybe if the tower was built on top of a meteor that already crashed, which could be the source of the lake to begin with. It's possible the meteor impact created a crater so large that it was flooded with coolant, and as such, the Orokin just built the reservoir tower in the middle for simplicity's sake. So, if you remember earlier when I was introducing the Vallis, I mentioned these strange cave plants that launch players and enemies when stood on. Well, it seems the Corpus are actually cultivating these plants deliberately, which can be seen at the grow site. This compound seems to be a greenhouse for these odd plants, with various drones monitoring the pods and a constant mist of something being spritzed on them. Our next outpost is Central Maintenance, which appears to be a repair bay for coil drives and other vehicles. There's also a garage building that contains a computer, which is sometimes hackable as a bounty objective. I imagine this contains records of things like repair dates and whatnot, which is understandably valuable information when tracking specific targets. Vehicles can also be found at the transit depot, which seems to be the primary compound for dispatching them, from coil drives to cargo trucks to even dropships. This area also has a large garage that can be accessed through a vent, revealing loads of crates and vehicle components within. There's also a large antenna nearby, which I imagine is used to communicate with the vehicles that are dispatched, as the coil drives and condors of the Vallis don't seem to be operated by pilots. At least not pilots that are actually inside the vehicles, you know what I mean. Moving on from vehicles, we have Reflector Control, which is a fairly small base that is likely used to communicate with, well, the Reflector. I don't know if I really need to explain this one, to be honest. There's also a small landing pad at the end of this nearby tunnel with a dropship present, which is curious. I'm not 100% sure why the space in particular got a landing pad, but I don't really think it matters. I'm just padding for time, to be honest. Heading back south, we have the Orokin dig site, where the Corpus are salvaging the remains of some massive Orokin structure. Considering the look of the architecture and its weird fleshy bits, it's highly reminiscent of the Unum's tower, though this time it's buried deep within the rock. It seems like there's some sort of large door or maybe even artifact present within the dig site that the Corpus are analyzing, though they have yet to excavate it. There's also this large crash structure here that we saw like in the Ice Planet tiles at Skybox. This thing is what's known as an orbital defense node, and it's part of a series of nodes present in Venus's orbit from the Orokin era. Steve explained this during the TennoCon 2018 Railjack demo, and we'll see more of it in the Railjack section before too long, but I wanted to note now what this thing is. The weirdest thing about this node is that, despite being pretty banged up, there's no way that it got here by crashing down from orbit, as that would have left a massive crater. I wonder if maybe the Corpus deliberately decommissioned it for study, but how exactly it got here is kind of a mystery. For our last standard point of interest, we have temple fabrication, where the Corpus are constructing a giant replica of Nephanio's head. In the post-quest version of the Vallis, this statue is of Ballas's head instead, which is a bit odd because I don't think they ever got around to making him a body. So why make a giant statue of Neph's head? Well, that leads us into our first major base, the Temple of Prophet. This temple is a massive in-progress statue of Nephanio, with its head unsurprisingly still missing. The temple seems to hold some kind of outright religious importance to the Corpus, as Flux News back in Fortuna regularly encourages donating to the temple as if it was some kind of megachurch or something. Outside of the temple is a very large auditorium area, with several badass crewman statues beyond the walls. At the very base of the statue is a podium, presumably for Neph to use for speeches, looking out at a pretty shallow seating area. The Exploiter Orb patrols nearby to protect the temple, and enemies killed in this area drop solatoroids. Toroids seem to be some kind of device used to power arachnoids, but their exact origin and purpose is unknown. Each major base has enemies in its proximity drop a specific toroid, and for the temple, it's the solatoroid. Walking inside the temple, we have these two side rooms that contain something. I think it's a generator or some shit, I don't really know. If we take the elevator down, we can find an in-progress interior that seems fairly unstable. I do wonder what this interior is ultimately supposed to be used for, but in its current state, construction seems to be slowed by a pool of coolant that needs draining. There's a large garage at the far end that may connect to a storage area or vehicle depot of some sort, but I can't say for sure. If you navigate through some vents, you can also find this hackable computer, but I don't actually know what it does. I haven't been able to find any information on this thing online, so if anybody knows how it works, please let me know. This computer terminal is going to be a recurring oddity throughout the major bases, so keep it in mind. To summarize, the temple is an enormous in-progress monument to one of the Corpus's most punchable elite. Our next major base is Spaceport, which can be found in the southeastern portion of the Vallis. This region drops the Vega toroid from enemies killed in its proximity, and doesn't seem to have an orb mother guarding it. The courtyard out front contains a wide array of vehicles, which seem to be primarily for transporting materials, alongside a few work and maintenance vehicles. If we circle around the back, we can find a large landing pad that has loading and unloading equipment. These things in conjunction lead me to believe that the primary purpose of the spaceport is to transport materials and supplies to and from the Vallis, which isn't super surprising. If we work our way through the garages and enter the complex itself, we're presented with a few options. To the left, we can find an area that seems to be used for cargo screening. Over on the right, there's a large turbine suspended over a pool of coolant. A terminal nearby causes the turbine to spin faster and faster until it breaks down and is briefly submerged in the coolant pool below. Between these two rooms is an upper area with a hologram of something? I'm not 100% sure what this is, to be honest, but it's neat. Moving past both of the previous doors takes us to a large room with two more routes to take. And if we take the left one, we can find a room with computers that show the results of the cargo screening. If we go back and instead head straight, we move into a large inner area where we can find a lot of cargo and transport vehicles. Looking up, you can see that there's a magnetic rail that's used to transport cargo as well. Windows throughout the area reveal cargo elevators transporting containers, as well as a few cargo elevators out in the open. This base also contains several vents near these cargo elevators that link to different parts of the complex, which I imagine are just there to make navigating the place easier. Overlooking the main area, there are two observation decks, both with holograms of different Corpus vehicles, one of a cargo truck and one of a Blizzard dropship. Editing cool kid here. They're called Buzzards. I've been misreading this as Blizzard for like 7 years. Above the central observation deck, you can find some vents, and through these vents, there's another one of those odd computers like at the Temple of Prophet. Again, I don't really know what hacking this thing does. To recap, Spaceport is, somewhat unsurprisingly, a base that is used primarily for imports and exports, bringing in crucial supplies and getting valuable findings off-world. There is a modified version of this base present in the Sneaky Sabotage Call mission, but it isn't the same structure, so I won't be talking about what it contains. I just wanted to mention it so nobody would comment about it, to be honest. Moving on to our last major base, I saved this one for the end because it's by far the most complex, the Enrichment Labs. This base drops the Calda toroids from enemies killed nearby, and perched atop the labs we can find the guardian for this facility, the Prophet Taker Orb. This base serves as the hub for research on both Orokin and sentient artifacts recovered in the area. The outside courtyard seems to contain mostly work vehicles and defense systems, alongside a holding area for prisoners. Moving inside, the lobby contains a small coolant flow and a statue of Nefanyo. I'm guessing this coolant flow is just a small visible portion of a larger flow that's used for monitoring and the like, which I'll show off in a bit. Moving past this lobby, we find an observation deck overlooking a central room with a large golden relic in the middle. There's a series of catwalks that connect to another observation deck at the far end of the room, or we can use the stairs to move down and get a closer look at the relic. This thing seems to be both fleshy and metallic, and I'm not entirely sure what it is or what it's here for. At the far end of the room, we can find two doors, one on each side, which lead to observation decks overlooking other parts of the facility. There are vents in these rooms that can be used to access the areas below, or we can take the doors at the far end of the relic room like a normal person. This leads to a junction with 3 routes, and we'll cover each of them individually. The left route takes us into a room that contains a wide array of specimens in containment. Let's first take a look at these dusky-headed verminx, which are locked up in a Vallis habitat and have some fun custom animations. We can also find a variety of Orokin-era servofish in captivity here, along with samples of the fungi and the golden launch pod plants. There's also what seems to be a small sample of infested tendrils here, which may tie into the specimen VK7 story and serve as research material from the infested hives that used to be present in the region. We can also find a terminal that is hackable during certain bounty objectives, which I imagine contains information about the specimens here. Off of this containment room is a side room where a sentient is being dissected, and past that, there's a window where Orokin debris can be seen moving through various screening fields. Moving back to the junction room, if we instead go right, we find a room full of coolant, alongside various pumps and pipes. I'm not sure if this coolant is used to actually cool machinery or if they're simply analyzing it, but this room is why I posited that the small pool in the lobby was likely connected to something larger. Branching off of this room is a side room containing a window. Beyond the window, you can see 2 vats of brightly colored liquid and a rail that transports pieces of Orokin Tower material. This material is dipped into each vat, stripping away the exterior layers and leaving only the golden lattice behind. I'm not really sure what this is for, but it's really interesting that this room even exists. Between the coolant room and the containment room, a small room with a laser can be found. This laser inflicts magnetic damage and knocks the player down, and I have no clue what its purpose is, but it is really funny. Moving back to the junction room, we now have the middle path to the back of the facility. The first thing you'll notice is this long hallway with a depressed floor. First off, mood. But more importantly, this floor has an alternating laser grid during bounty objectives that send the player to this part of the enrichment labs. Moving through the hallway and into the room itself, we find a large open room with a glass cell containing a sentient conculist. I can't believe they put him in the jar. This area is suspended above the ground, completely separate from the rest of the room, but that doesn't make it inaccessible. We'll get to that in a moment, though. First, let's move across the room to this side door, where we can find a large device that looks like some kind of computer. According to the Profit Taker bounties, this device is used to communicate with the Overcharger satellite, which is a giant orbital device that is used to make Profit Taker shields virtually indestructible. Off in another side room, you can find a Batacore next to a button that, when pressed, causes the weapon to fire a laser and destroy a target. Near this weapons test, you can also find a terminal that, when hacked, raises the glass around the conculist. There's a terminal here that is hackable during certain bounty objectives, and I imagine it's what contains the most sensitive of the Corpus's sentient research. I'm pretty sure that the conculist has a very small chance to wake up when the glass is lifted, but I haven't been able to trigger it in literal years, so I have no clue if it's still possible. Dropping down below the conculist containment area, you can find a vent that leads to one of those weird computers like we saw in the spaceport in the temple, but this one isn't actually hackable. This room also links through the vents up to the junction room, which brings us full circle. So that was a lot to get through, but I actually have one more thing I want to talk about in regards to the enrichment labs. During the Profit Taker bounties, we're introduced to 3 Corpus directors who oversee various operations at the labs. I'm going to go ahead and read their codex descriptions now, as they provide interesting insight into what goes on at this facility. Sentient Research Director. Director of Sentient Studies at Enrichment Labs. The man Nef Anyo has entrusted to reverse engineer recovered sentient technology. Armaments Director. Enrichment Lab's Director of Weapons Research, responsible for advanced weapons prototypes and refinement. Vivisect Director. Enrichment Lab's Director of Animal Dissection and Experimentation, works closely with the Feed and Research Division. Now that we're through all of the major bases and traditional points of interest, I want to move on to the caves that dot the Vallis. In particular, I want to focus on this cave, which houses the entrance to Deck 12. There's a terminal here with symbols on it that relate to the original community effort to unlock this door, so don't worry about it, it doesn't mean much these days. Moving through the cave, we arrive at what looks like a carbon copy of the main Fortuna area, but overgrown with fungus after what seems like years of abandonment. We learn from Utico that this is where she and many other Solaris were originally stationed, but during a Solaris United uprising, the Exploiter Orb was sent in to crush the rebellion. This resulted in the death of several important Solaris, such as Thursby's parents and Zood's sisters, at the hands of the Orb Mother. Or, claws? Mandibles? What are these things? It doesn't matter. The important thing is that the survivors were transferred to Fortuna, and Zood more or less went nuts. Now, while this place is very similar to Fortuna, it does contain something unique: thermia condensers, which are used as a major mechanic in the Exploiter Orb boss fight that also takes place here. If we head back topside and look out beyond the map border, we can even see the elevator leading down to Deck 12, along with the frozen corpses of several Solaris. It's honestly pretty disturbing seeing these guys out in the winter storm, forever trapped in that last terrifying moment trying to flee certain death in the facility below. Now, while Deck 12 is by far the most important cave, I still think many of the others are very interesting. Most of them contain pretty similar features: coolant flows that ice up in spots, glowing mushrooms, plenty of tepa plants, and cave pools that house special servofish, alongside the occasional trampoline plant. I'm honestly just kinda yammering to pad for time because I want to show footage of these caves, as I find them really pretty. Several caves do contain more features than just this though, and I want to talk about them. First and foremost, several caves contain what seem to be the remains of collapsed weeping towers. There's a lot more of these than you'd expect, and the Corpus are even studying one that went down near the transit depot. I'm, again, just gonna run my mouth to keep showing these things off because there's quite a few of them and they're all super interesting. Near Reflector Control, there's a cave that contains this giant metal cast-looking thing. I don't know if it's the roots of a tower, a crashed glacier, or something else entirely, but it's really cool. It reminds me of what it looks like when molten aluminum is poured into an anthill, but that's just me. Near Harindi Crater, this small cave can be found which contains something kind of odd: a weird-looking light post hanging over a small patch of very unique fungus. It seems like the Corpus may be using some kind of grow light for a rare type of mitocardial fungus, but we don't have much information to work with. Near the Orokin dig site, there's a cave that contains the remains of a crashed rover, but that's not the only interesting thing here. If you move down the cave, you can find this room with a pool of electrified coolant. Standing on this, barrel thing will pacify the coolant, allowing you to move through this small gap and down a frozen coolant flow, terminating in a trampoline plant that takes you back up to the surface. Also near the Orokin dig site is this cave, which has a giant glowing ring in it. I don't know what it is, but it's neat. God, this video's writing is so ass. At the very west edge of the map, a Corpus raft can be found in the coolant, alongside a table with various supplies. Considering the supplies look to be of Solaris origin, I wonder if this area is a site for Solaris scouts or SU operatives to hunker down. Further supporting this is a hidden passageway behind the raft, which can be accessed by pressing this button to pull the raft away from the far wall. This area contains a small garden that's honestly really picturesque, and it makes me wonder if dead drops and the like are hidden here by SU operatives. North of the grow site, we find a massive cave that contains something very unique: a collapsed Orokin road. It goes on for quite a while, and several golden tendrils that are the trademark of the Weeping Towers and glacial impacts are also present. We also have another giant glowing ring, and components that are reminiscent of the Weeping Towers even beyond the tendrils. I wonder if this road was maybe demolished at some point to make room for a tower, or if a nearby tower collapsed and took the road down with it. Alright, I saved the best cave for last. At the very north of the Orb Vallis, you can find this cave that contains the Cinematic Mushroom. Absolutely gorgeous. I love this place. Okay, now that we're through the caves, I want to bring up some minor locations on the Vallis that aren't marked on the map. The first is this holding area just outside of Fortuna, which seems to be the site of like half of my bounty objectives, but it also contains a vent that connects back to the enrichment labs. It's only usable during the third Profit Taker bounty, but I think it goes to show just how large the facility actually is on the inside. South of the transit depot, you can find a pond with a crashed Condor dropship that the Corpus are trying to fish up, but that doesn't seem to be going great. Near the Temple of Profit, we can find a Weeping Tower that's in a severe state of disrepair, though unlike many of the other destroyed posts, it's remained above ground. Dotted around the Vallis, we can also find the de-icing stations that Jeff mentioned in Devstream 107.
And here's another look.
Yeah. So they're like, again, the artists are really kind of being really like they're kind of doing really cool world building things with building on the narrative ideas. So like these are de-icing stations that there's some design stuff in the works. I don't know how much you want to talk about that.
No. We'll just do top level here.
Okay.
Yep.
So, but there's a reason why they need de-icing stations
Yep.
for some gameplay design stuff. And
Based on what Jeff said, it sounds like these were originally going to have some kind of gameplay purpose, but nowadays they stick around purely as neat set pieces for Corpus patrols to gather around. I imagine that de-icing gear is still relevant in lore. It makes sense logically at the very least, but whatever mechanic was supposed to be tied to it never made it into release. We can also find detention centers all across the Vallis, used by the Corpus to hold Solaris prisoners. Some are affixed to outposts, while others are off by their lonesome, but they all serve the same purpose of detaining dissenters until their punishments can be doled out. Lastly, let's talk about the thing that I know many of you have been waiting for, the pond by the Orokin dig site. You remember how I mentioned that Spaceport was the only major base with no Orb Mother guarding it? Well, that's only partially true, because you actually can find a third Orb Mother within this pool. This piece of shit has been napping in the tub for 7 whole years. It slept through an entire system-wide war and still didn't wake up. Post-New War, there's a Narmer drone monitoring the orb, but at this point I'm convinced the bastard is actually dead. If you make it out of bounds, you can see that the orb is fully modeled and everything, and while DE has said that they want to do something with it eventually, I've genuinely given up hope at this point. Okay, we're now through all of the on-the-ground exploration for the Vallis. We're not done with the location quite yet though, as I want to cap off this section by reading the description of various items and resources from this area, as they provide a lot of interesting tidbits. I debated putting the various animals in this video, but I'm going to save that for Warframe Geographic too, so we're going to skip them for now. So then, first up, I want to circle back to the servofish. These guys have a lot of different unique functions and drop items related to those functions, and I think that they contain a lot of cool lore about what goes on in the coolant that runs across the surface of Venus. So let's get into it. II, a surveillance drone that monitors any activity that disturbs the water. It can be found in ponds around Venus. It drops the II Rotoblade, a machine element used to propel robotic organisms through coolant. Scrubber analyzes the growth of microbes dwelling in the aqua systems to monitor toxicity levels. It can be found in cave pools on Venus. Drops the Scrubber Exabrain, a small electronic brain capable of processing 1 billion gigathreads per second. Echo Winder, used to record visual data in the aqua systems and transmits the telemetrics to the research station. It can be found in the lake on Venus. Drops the Echo Winder Anoscopic Sensor, a small camera that records visual data with extremely high definition. Mire Winder, surveys the water for impurities. It can be found in cave pools on Venus. Drops the Mire Winder Parallel Biode, controls the electrical flow throughout the circuitry within robotic organisms. Longwinder, repairs leaks and clears blockages within the aqua systems. It can be found in the lake on Venus. Drops Longwinder Lathe Coagulant, a liquid that mixes with coolant fluid to produce a resilient gel that repairs leaks. Bricky, developed to perform remote construction and maintenance routines. It can be found in rivers and ponds around Venus. Drops the Bricky Muon Battery, a small atomic power source. Tink, repairs robotics that have broken down in the aqua systems. It can be found in rivers and ponds around Venus. Drops the Tink Dissipator Coil, discharges excess heat and energy through the casing. Sapcaddy, collects fluid samples in the aqua systems for the research station. It can be found in lakes around Venus. It drops the Sapcaddy Venadu case, a strong, metallic case that is resistant to fluctuations in environmental temperature. Side note, there is an alloy called Venera alloy that comes from the Vallis, so I've always wondered if this was a typo. Kriller, identifies organic threats to Corpus operations in the aqua systems and fucking kills them. That's not what the description says. Identifies organic threats to Corpus operations in the aqua systems and eliminates them. It can be found in lakes around Venus. Drops the Kriller Thermal Laser, a weapon that discharges lasers over short distances. Recaster, facilitates long-distance communication between robotics deployed in the aqua systems. It can be found in the ponds around Venus. Drops the Recaster Neural Relay, interprets signals from other mechanical organisms. Moving on to the ancient Orokin era bots, we have 3. Tromazin, programmed to break down chemical byproducts leaked into the aqua systems. It can be found in the ponds around Venus. Drops Tromazin Entroplasma, a solvent that reconstitutes waste product from the Weeping Towers into degenerated matter. Karamote, its primary function is to reconstruct the biomaterial used to regenerate Orokin structures. It can be found in the cave pools on Venus. Drops Karamote Sagan Module, a device used to reconstruct degenerated matter into Orokin biomaterial. Cinethid, monitors environmental fluctuations. It can be found in the cave pools on Venus. Drops Cinethid Ecosynth Analyzer, a processing unit that efficiently monitors environmental data. Whenever you offer up a Cinethid to Biz, he also says the following quote.
Wade, do you know what this is? An original Orokin custodial drone. Where in the world did you find this? Most people have only ever seen this fellow in pictures. Old pictures. He must have been down there for centuries.
Moving on from the servofish, I want to take a look at the resource and mining drops, as they also contain some neat information. Gorgericus Spore. The reproductive spore of the giant Vallis fungi is highly coveted for the complex chemical compounds it contains. Mitocardia Spore. A fungal body prized for its various uses. The mitocardia sac that drops this item is described as follows. This sprouting fungal body protects and conceals mitocardia spores, its hidden treasure. Tepa Nodule. The iridescent nodules on these plants grow brightly in cold environments. The type of plant that drops these is described as follows. A plant that thrives in frigid environments. Its nodules are highly sought after for their iridescent properties. Thermal sludge, a byproduct from the Weeping Tower's terraforming process. Dropped by the thermal sludge container, which reads, canister built to safely store thermal sludge. Well, go figure, I guess. Now on to mining gems and metals. Phasmin, an eerily green gem found encased in metallic shards. Traveride, a mineral hardened by the crushing pressure of the Venusian atmosphere. Noctral, a black gemstone with iridescent blue impurities. Axodite, a sediment that formed from sulfuric rain that became trapped under the ice. Goblite, a strange crystal that grows inside the veins of extracted ore. Veneral, a precious metal forged from coolant byproducts. Amarast, a violet gem that forms from the crystallization of byproducts expelled from the Weeping Towers. It's mentioned in the Voxelaris quest that Amarast is also used for thermal regulation in the Weeping Towers as well. Hesperon, clay that strengthens into extremely durable stone when brought to temperatures below zero. Zodian, a blue gem that radiates astral energy. Fist, a beautiful and iridescent red shard. Okay, I hope you're still awake because we're finally through all of the intricacies of the Orb Vallis. I hope that wasn't too confusing because damn it was a tough section to write. This video is not over quite yet though, as we have one last topic I want to cover, Venus Proxima. Before getting into how it is in-game currently, I want to show off this absolutely incredible surface-to-space transition from TennoCon 2018.
There are many emergency exits aboard this spacecraft, operator. Please take note of the one nearest you. In the unlikely event of a violent decompression, safety lights will illuminate the floor to guide you. We're in for some chocolate. Ascent complete, operator. You have the helm.
This never made it into the game, but god, it's so cool. You have no idea how bad I wish this stayed in. So, moving into Railjack in the modern day, the first thing you'll probably notice is the incredible amount of Orokin space junk. You remember the orbital defense node from the Vallis? Well, up here you can find them everywhere. Not just in the play space, but out in the distance of the Skybox there are too many to count. Well, I guess you could count them, but that would be a massive waste of time. There also appears to be some giant superstructure out in the distance, though I'm not sure if it's Corpus or Orokin. It does seem to have sustained some kind of damage, but it's hard to tell with how far away it is. Looking out into the skybox, we seem to only be able to see the reflector. Or maybe it's the sun? Only one light source is visible, I guess that's the easiest way to put it. We can also look down to the planet itself and see what appear to be the violent firestorms like Thursby mentioned, which is interesting. These could be signs of volcanic activity or extreme weather brought on by the massive temperature variation from the terraformed regions to the rest of the planet. I'm not going to go too in-depth about the Corpus ships and side objectives, as I want to save that for Neptune's episode, but I do want to dig into the region's unique optional objective, one of the very orbital defense nodes that we've been seeing pop up throughout this video. According to the wiki, this point of interest is officially called the Orokin Shield Derelict, which makes sense considering its original purpose was as part of a defense grid. Looking at the outside, we see a large Corpus structure attached to the node, alongside a beam of blue light that goes down to the surface. I wonder if this could be related to the blue light in the Ice Planet tileset skybox. It could also be related to the controlled descent that brought the other nodes down, or it could also be a teleporter link for transporting valuables found within the node, as we have seen the Corpus use similar technology when deploying squads to the Orb Vallis. Entering the structure itself, we move first through the Corpus half, which is a long hallway that leads to a large open room. In the middle of this room is a hologram of the defense node with various points marked on it, though what these waypoints mean is not entirely clear. We'll also encounter Corpus resistance in this area, which reveals that the Venus Proxima sector is occupied by the Terra Corpus, identified by their gray and yellow jumpsuits. Moving into the Orokin part of the structure, we find a main room containing what seems to be a large Aetan sculpture, as well as many machines that the Corpus are using to study and pillage the Derelict. Rooms branching off of this point appear to be retrofitted from the Orokin Moon and Orokin Tower tile sets, with obvious modifications to better blend in with the rundown nature of the ancient shield satellite. As an optional side objective, these structures do contain a hackable terminal that grants a reward, and I'll go ahead and show the reward table on screen now because I don't really feel like reading it. Overall, these structures are really fascinating, and I'm still itching to know how exactly they worked and why the crashed ones on the surface leave no craters behind on impact. Maybe these questions will be answered one day, but our last major Railjack update was like 4 years ago, so I'm not holding my breath. So, that was Venus, both in reality and the world of Warframe. Going from a crushing, scorching hellscape to a winter wonderland oozing with lore and detail, this is probably my favorite planet in the entire game. This episode ended up being much longer than I first expected, so if you're still watching, I highly appreciate it. I also hugely appreciate my channel members who help make this content possible. I wouldn't be able to pursue such a niche and nerdy topic without your guys' help and insight. I also want to specifically thank Gray Archon of the Orokin Archive for sending over loads of resources that helped immensely in bringing this video to life. Let me know your thoughts and theories in the comments, like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and thank you so much for watching. I've had a wonderful time as your host this evening, and I'll see you all next time when we talk about locations that are a bit closer to home, Earth and Lua.